part of this series. The next program that we will be having will be with Damani and Ife Keene. They will be our April speakers, so we want to make sure that we have everybody's email address so that we can keep you informed about what's coming up next. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ida Jones, who is the president of the Bethel Dukes branch of ASALH, and she is the university archivist at Morgan State University. And she was also an archivist at Howard University and has played a number of roles and done a number of presenting in several places. So I invite you to look her up and find out about some of the books that she's written. And we do plan to have her as a guest speaker at another time. But without further ado, I'll let our president take over and bring us a welcome and to introduce our next speaker, LaVonda Broadneck, after that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Eric, and welcome to the March presentation of the Bethel Dukes branch of ASALH. The Bethel Dukes branch, formerly known as the Southeast Northeast branch, is located we were formerly known as the Far Southeast Northeast branch in Washington, D.C. We are part of a larger matrix called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded in 1915 by the late Dr. Carter G. Woodson and a coterie of other scholars. In 1915, it debuted a film called Birth of a Nation. This film was considered history written in light by then President Woodrow Wilson. In this film, African-American persons were depicted with cork-faced white actors showing ravenous, vile African-American men ravishing people after the Civil War. In response to this, Dr. Carter G. Woodson met in Chicago, Illinois, and organized the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. It was chartered in Washington, D.C. in 1915 and formed the National Association, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Woodson believed education was the principal tool essential in dismantling race prejudice, white supremacy, and xenophobia. Over the 100 plus 15 years of the association's history, we continue to do the vision of Woodson's work, dismantling white supremacy, xenophobia, and overall hatred through education, knowing and sharing the history of the Africana diaspora with African people and the world at large. The Bethel Dukes branch for over 40 years has, in the Washington, D.C. area, continued that vision of Woodson. Named for the original convener, Bethel M. Dukes, we changed our name from the Far Southeast Northeast branch to accommodate the vision and the philanthropy of Bethel Dukes and his wife, Paula Dukes. We continue to do this work, and so we welcome you to join us. We have a YouTube channel where you can look at previous programs that we have sponsored, and we invite you to consider joining the association as well. All of this will be shared in the chat, but just in brief, asalh.org is the homepage that lands all of this. So welcome, sit back, and enjoy. I'll now shift to invite you to our next presenter, Miss LaVonda Broadneck. She is a new member of our branch, and she's already engaged in the woman-friendly Bethel Dukes community. She is a retired librarian with a substantial career in librarianship at Howard University and recently the Library of Congress. Thank you, Ms. Broadneck. The mic is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome again. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Seniors is an associate professor at Virginia Tech. Her principal areas of research include comparative U.S. history, ethnic studies and African American studies, African American and multiracial radical movements, film, theater, and dance. Dr. Seniors won the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize from the Association of Black Women Historians for her work, Beyond Lift Every Voice and Sing, the culture of uplift, identity, and politics in Black musical theater. She's also the co-author of Michelle Obama's Impact on African American Women and Girls, in which her chapter, Reconfiguring Black Motherhood, Michelle Obama and the Mom in Charge, appears. Dr. Seniors is currently working on 2 manuscripts. One, African American Women Wept, Police and State Violence Against African American Girls and Women. Number 2, Scott Joplin's Tremonisha, Dr. T.J. Anderson, and the 1972 Atlanta, Georgia world premiere of An American Opera. Related to the ASALH theme for 2021, which is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity, Dr. Seniors is the biographer of her family's legacy. Today, she will present from her forthcoming book, which has a focus on her family's heritage. Mae Mallory, the Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolutions, African American Women Radical Activists. As has been stated, our program today is being recorded, but just sit back, relax, and prepare to learn. This is not a typical family story. Dr. Seniors?
Can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me. Dr. Jones, Mr. White, Ms. Green, Ms. Broadnax, and the Bethel Dukes ASALH. Thank you for inviting me. So I put this picture up first because sometimes we don't know our family history. And evidently this is a key women's studies image. And there is my mother right in the center. I had no idea that this image existed. I can't move. Oh, here we go. So sorry. Okay, in 1961, African-American working class self-defense advocate Mae Mallory traveled to from New York to Monroe, North Carolina to provide support and weapons for the Negroes with Guns movement. Accused of kidnapping a Ku Klux Klan couple, she spent almost 2 years in a Cleveland jail facing extradition. African-American women radical activists, Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson of the Negroes with Guns movement, my adopted grandmother, my mother, Audrey Proctor Seniors of the band National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Ruthie Stone of the Workers' World Party founded the Monroe Defense Committee to support Mallory. My father, Clarence Henry Seniors of Workers' World, would join them, as did 16-year-old Pat Mallory, Mae's daughter. These women emerged as organic intellectuals and bonded permanently as family. The 1970s and 1980s, Pat, Mae, and Audrey joined the Tanzanian, Grenadian, and Nicaraguan revolutions, respectively. And Ethel Johnson advocated for world revolutions in her newsletter, Did You Know? Now, what I want to know is what led these women and girls to actively participate in world revolutions? Mrs. Johnson always traveled with us from town to town for protest meetings as our babysitter, for she loved her granddaughter. She had the best car and preferred driving on these trips. She knew everyone in North Carolina, and her friends welcomed us, giving us that first-class treatment. We spent hours at Mrs. Johnson's house working on Did You Know? and listening to her extensive jazz collection. Clarence Henry Seniors, quote, "As the slaves rebelled again and again against their masters, so must the Black race grasp the torch that Nat Turner and others have handed to us and hold it high by continuously fighting for freedom." 1959, Mrs. Johnson, age 43. So the beautifully brown-skinned Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson, my grandmother, was born in Abbeville, South Carolina on January 31st, 1916. Abbeville played a pivotal role in Johnson's political and intellectual growth, informing her self-defense ideology. Now, these Blacks came from soldier stock from Sierra Leone, Gambia, Angola, and Senegal, and they participated in extreme militaristic and intellectual resistance to white supremacist violence. So, for example, in 1848, 3 slaves killed their owners, and they remained resolutely unrepentant while going to their lynching. Quote, "They regard themselves as martyrs in the cause of liberty and cheerfully die to better the condition of the 100 plus Blacks on the plantation," end quote. So these Abbeville African Americans defied death itself. So with this ideology, they built a historical community of struggle and resistance. In 1959, Ethel Azalea Johnson brought this ideology to Monroe as the secretary, vice president, and founding member of the Negroes with Guns movement with Robert F. Williams and Dr. Albert Perry. Now, they were founded after the loss of 2 rape cases where the white rapist walked free. Johnson pronounced, quote, "The only alternative Black people have left is a self-defense ideology," end quote. So as the founding member and chairwoman of Philadelphia's Revolutionary Action Movement and the writer and publisher of the Crusader newsletter and Didn't You Know newsletter, the latter of which my parents published with her, Mrs. Johnson used Abbeville's historical community of struggle and resistance ideology in her activism. Her mother, a maid and a laundress, life lessons also informed her ideology. Did you know, 1961? My mother knew that she and her 4 parents, along with millions of other Afro-Americans, had been deprived of their human and civil rights. In her unpolished way, she planted the seeds of discontent in her children. Discontent with any and everything inhumane. Never rest contented, she'd say, until all men are free. One thing the Jim Crow laws and discriminatory policies of America did not do to her: break her spirit and lust for freedom. My mother never experienced living as a free person, but she always was free in her heart. So Ethel Azalea Johnson's mother's lessons shaped her ideologies. Through her writings, she connected Monroe's poverty to Cuban poverty during Batista's reign, modeling the Crusaders' Association for the Relief and Enlightenment after Cuban revolutionary initiatives. In 1963, with the help of my parents, they offered food, clothing, shoes, a food garden, and enlightenment to Monroe's African American community, predating the 1970 Black Panthers free breakfast program, doing what the state would not do. Now, during times of great stress, Johnson left Monroe for Philadelphia Abbeville's sister city, where she and 19-year-old Max Stanford co-founded and co-chaired the Revolutionary Action Movement. Johnson charged colonized diasporic youth to lead world revolutions. In 1963, she wrote about RAM's response to police attacks on African-American demonstrators picketing for jobs. Quote, many Afro-Americans, after witnessing the attacks on their relatives and friends on the picket lines, left the demonstration, but returned with 45s and straight razors, end quote. Now, this offers us a window into her self-defense ideology and her influence on RAM's combat-ready youth. So she, in 1966 and 67, wrote this, quote, long live the great leaders of the international liberation struggles. Long live the people of the international liberation struggles. May the eyes of the people on the local front be open and their ears unstopped so that they may hear the roar of world revolution and do what must be done, for the strength of the organized masses is invincible. So she compelled her readers to join her in world revolutions. So what happened in Monroe in 1961? The national branch of the NAACP, the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King Jr. and others sent the Freedom Riders to Monroe in 1961 to teach them the effectiveness of passive resistance. The Negroes with Guns members feared that the white supremacists in their communities would retaliate, so they called their friends for physical support. Mae Mallory answered the call and traveled with the writer Julian Mayfield with weapons from her Harlem Crusaders family fundraisers and a Harlem gangster who gave her the weapons. On Sunday, August 27, 1961, 5,000 armed Ku Klux Klan and police viciously attacked the demonstrators, invaded the heavily militarized and armed Black community, and a Ku Klux Klan couple, the Steagles, pushed their way into the Williams home. They left unharmed, but Mae recounted that Chief Monty, quote, threatened to have us all hanging by our heels by the end of the minute, charging them all with kidnapping the Steagles. Williams abandoned Mallory in New York, escaping to Cuba. Mae fled to Cleveland only to have her family turn her in to the FBI. As I said previously, she spent almost close to 2 years in a jail and faced extradition. My mother and I regularly visited Mae and Pat in their Harlem skyscraper, with Malcolm X's picture prominently displayed in their house as it was in ours. Pat, Mae, and my mother would wrap my friend Hindi and I in fabulous galas and beautiful African fabrics. Mae was gregarious and wonderful, with an infectious laugh and warm arms that embraced me. Pat, a grown-up with her afro, was beautiful and fun to be around. They made me feel cherished. Family. In 1930, at the age of 3, while living with her cousin Tempia in Macon, Georgia, Mae Mallory formulated her self-defense ideology. A white store owner, Mrs. Saloon, gave Black children maggot-filled cheese. Mallory, I slapped this garbage out of the woman's hands and she slapped me. And I ran home crying. So this cousin made me to explain to her why I was crying. Somehow or another, I just told her that the little girl had hit me. So she told me to go back there, and even if Mary Saloon had crawled up her mother's dress, to go back there and slap her. And so I went back to the store, and Mary was behind the counter, you see, and I went back there and I popped her, and then I ran home. Mrs. Saloon called the police, who came looking for this little nigger who had hit a white woman, end quote. Cousin Tempia castigated them. Why, you white people look so stupid. You mean you had to have 15 motorcycle cops come for this? And she held up, this little fat black rounded ball of flesh that was me. She said, now don't you look ridiculous? She really made them feel a fool. So they told her she would have to teach me that I'd have to respect white people. And so my cousin told them, you tell them they have to respect us. Tempia gave Mae a self-defense model which proved successful, for the white supremacists did not retaliate against this family in a state, according to Ida B. Wells, that ranked #1 in lynching. Now, while Tempia and Mae did escape harm, they left Georgia soon after the incident for Brooklyn because, Mae says, my mother could see I wasn't gonna make it so good in the South. In Brooklyn, Mae wanted to be a scholar. The public schools and her family obstructed her aspirations. Her family arranged an arranged marriage at 17 with 2 children in the mix. Mae, now I love babies, but I think there is something else in life besides having a baby and rearing it. So I left him with 2 children in tow. Working in factories, Mae chose a life of learning and political activism, fighting to desegregate the New York City schools on Pat's behalf, finding agency with the Negroes with Guns movement, and arrested in 1961, accused of kidnapping the Ku Klux Klan couple. She used dream escape to survive her incarceration. Quote, the wind moans around the 7th floor of Cleveland's skyscraper on 21st Street and Payne Avenue. It sounds like the pathetic cries of a dying prehistoric animal, according to Hollywood soundtracks. These sounds are frightening to the inmates that are hearing them for the first time. This noise does not bother me. I am used to it. I have lived on the 12th floor of a New York City housing project. So Mae identifies 21st and Payne as what Catherine McKittrick calls a geography of domination, with prisoners within a Hollywood horror movie come to life, entrapped within the carcass of this dinosaurian structure, rendered invisible and robbed of their freedom. Mallory's own life experience in New York City's housing projects buffered her from fearing the roaring dinosaurian edifice, but she still writes it was a menacing place. Upon Mae's 1961 arrest, the Cleveland Monroe Defense Committee, quote, a group with a way out philosophy of self-defense against mobsters, end quote, led by my mother, Audrey Proctor, Ruthie Stone, Mrs. Johnson, my father, and the workers' world came to Mae's aid. My mother was so glamorous and beautiful. She smelled wonderful. She felt wonderful. I remember as a 4 or 5-year-old watching my mother in her bedroom before a night out in her black, sparkly hot pants outfit. a cloud of powder wafting the air, haloing around her face. Sitting on her bed, her heartbeat, the softness of her when I put my head on her breast, ruining the Christmas of her beautiful hot pink outfit. But she didn't mind, my mother. In 1958 New Orleans, Audrey Proctor, a diminutive 17-year-old, a recent high school graduate and advocate for self-defense, took her initial steps towards radical activism. My first involvement in the area of social and political change began in New Orleans in the late 1950s. Along with a number of my peers, I became a card-carrying member of the NAACP, which at that time was a very radical thing to do. Now, becoming a member of New Orleans NAACP did prove extremely radical, given that the FBI surveilled them since the 40s, and in the 1956, the state made membership illegal. My mother became an unrepentant and unapologetic socialist and communist, follower of Paul Robeson, a lifelong advocate of unions, living wages, fair and decent working conditions, and affordable housing. In 1961, at the age of 21, my mother moved to Cleveland, became an organic intellectual, analyzing Lenin, Marx, and First World Revolutionary theory, supporting Third World revolutions, and the Negroes with Guns movement. She joined the Monroe Defense Committee as the office manager, Workers' World, Youth Against War and Fascism, and met my father, Clarence Henry Seniors. Audrey. In 1964, the extradition battle was lost for Mae. Within 2 weeks after the extradition, I, along with my husband, made our way to Monroe, North Carolina to fight for Mallory. In Monroe, my mother and my father worked with Mrs. Johnson, and my mother wrote Monroe, North Carolina for the Partisan, quote, "It had been pitch dark for some time. I was out of cigarettes and Jess had to go to the store for a pack. A small group of Black men were standing there. I was alone, but not really afraid. So Audrey unveils a Southern poor working class scenario of Black men, quote, always surrounded by all the small children in the neighborhood, end quote, subjected to welfare laws that legally denied these families welfare, a life together, and living wage. My mother watched them from the window. All of a sudden it happened. These men lit out in the trash pile so fast I was stunned. I was not looking at a pack of hungry dogs. I was looking at strong, able-bodied men who speak back to me as I say hello to them every day, respecting me as I respect them. There is no doubt in my mind that they sincerely want to be true and good providers for their wives and children if they had a chance for an honest living. But there's no chance for them in Monroe. There isn't even a chance to be nothing but a man. In 1965, the Mallory case was won, and Mae and our family moved to New York. My mother continued her activism with Workers' World, joined the Black Panthers, and marched against the Vietnam War and other wars. Disillusioned by the outcomes of the civil rights movement, my mother traveled to Grenada and Nicaragua to join their socialist revolutions. From 1984 to 1987, she worked as a brigadista in Nicaragua, picking coffees for the Sandinista. In 1984, she met with the mothers of heroes and martyrs. My mother relayed her encounter with one woman whose daughter perished at the hands of the Contras. In Brigadista Harvest, she wrote, "The mother asked us to tell the mothers of the United States not to let their sons come to invade Nicaragua. Quote, we know what it is to lose a child, and we do not wish this to happen to anyone else." This mother despairingly extended fellowship mother to mother, but with steely determination warned, if your sons come here to invade us, they will be killed. Many times since, I have reflected on these words and what they mean for Black and Latino mothers and families here. History has shown in Vietnam and most recently in Grenada that it is Blacks and the poor who are on the front lines fighting United States dirty wars. Black mothers must bury our sons, and all of us suffer the emotional and economic hardships of their loss to our communities. Now, I believe that my mother felt insurmountable anguish. And because of this, she committed herself to transforming the US system of exploitation. She recruited Third World Brigades to Nicaragua, gave interviews, spoke to African American organizations, and wrote articles. The 1957 school desegregation case left 12-year-old Pat Mallory blacklisted at school and named considered a communist, and a mother in jail for initiating the desegregation case. Pat was confused and devastated. Now, after a difficult childhood, Pat arose like a phoenix as a Black nationalist rebel girl at Seward Park High School. I considered myself a Black nationalist since a teenager. Pat excelled at school as the president of the Negro Culture Club, the multiracial anti-nuclear war symposium club, because we were not trying to prepare for war. Pat attended Black nationalist activities in Harlem. Oh, we got very Afrocentric. We got our African names and the beads representing one god or another, and that was it. And I decided to go natural, and the singer Abby Lincoln, in fact, did my hair. I hung out with Mama Keke's Harlem Yoruba Temple people. Pat attended Miss Natural Standard of Beauty contest, the Grandassa Models fashion shows, the Nation of Islam Temple 7, listening to Malcolm and verbally sparring with the boxer Muhammad Ali. Oh, he was such a loudmouth. And as a Black nationalist rebel girl, she chose radical activism to advocate for change. Quote, I remember when Pat went to the mythic Africa. My mother and I went to the airport, and I recall the utter excitement when Pat went on the plane. Now, this was a time when you can go to the plane. You can't do that anymore. I remember picking her up when she returned after the big bus instigated by the CIA to destabilize Tanzania. Pat gave me this beautiful African doll and beautiful carved wooden tea set. Now, I discovered in our talks that it was not the mythical Africa, but in fact, Tanzania, where Pat went. After high school, Pat made her way to the State University of New York, Stony Brook, where she and the other students demanded and successfully received a Black dorm and the founding of a Black Studies department. She received her master's degree from New York University, and in 1971 moved to Tanzania to join the revolution. In 1961, Tanzania gained independence from Britain, adopted Ujamaa, African socialism, and invited African Americans to help build the country. Now, the United States sent, quote, strategically placed African American CIA agents, end quote. Pat, I had to go because of what it promised to be. It was an adventure, and I believed in African socialism. Prime Minister Nyerere was talking about unity and building a nation. Nobody was getting more than what they needed or deserved. Everything was free. Medicine was free. Oh man, it sounded like a place where we could make a contribution. I didn't even wait for my papers when I graduated from New York University. I just left and went to Tanzania. They needed teachers. So I asked Pat how she involved herself in the Tanzanian Revolution. She said, quote, I went to teach English, language, composition, and Latin in Mwanza at Inganza Secondary School. I just lived the life of a school teacher, supporting the government in that way, not taking expatriate salary, being paid local wages like everyone else. So for Pat, teaching was a political act. Pat says, my mother was dying to get to Tanzania, and I was the vehicle to get there. In February 1972, Mae Mallory did what any self-possessed African-American radical woman would do when rejecting oppressive systems. She quit her nurse's aide job, let the post office know that she was moving, offering no forwarding address, skipped paying her phone bill, and as any true African-American woman rebel leaving the US to join the African Revolution would do, she skipped out on her rent. I asked Pat if she had done the same thing. She said, oh, no. I paid my bills. My mother was a gangster. I knew my mother and grandmother were coming. I did not know when they were coming. So Pat enjoyed her life in Tanzania, having adventures. Oh, I met this young man who was an area commissioner. Oh, slick. He showed me around. And one night I was getting ready for a date, and I'm looking, and I see this cab coming down the road, stopping in front of my door. Huh. Out comes Mae Mallory and my grandmother. Oh my gosh, the jig was up. They messed up my thing. Now, Pat, in her grown, independent woman splendor, maintained her composure and her plans. This young man and I did go out, but Pat says when she returned from her date, oh, my mother and grandmother talked themselves a blue streak. You don't know anything about this person, blah. And so that was it. But Pat indicated that she still lived and enjoyed her life independent of her mother in Tanzania. These African-American radical women activists, Ethel Azalea Johnson, Mae Mallory, Audrey Proctor Seniors, and Pat Mallory, created family cemented by resistance. Under state repression and surveillance, they raged, and in their raging, they accomplished amazing and extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seniors. I love your presentation format, and I think it's great because people do not know that you have a background in musical theater. And so I know you Broadway, and it does kind of bring these women to life. And I would like to first thank you so much for taking the time to share about your mother as a prism through which you see refracted the sense of duty and activism. I'd like to know, in terms of your own scholarship, how does it feel to write from the inside out as an academically trained scholar, and then the daughter of? How does that work for you?
Yes. So initially, when I started this project, I was encouraged by Gloria Dickinson, Carol Boyce Davies, Denise Da Silva, Sandra. Skipping her name. But anyway, they encouraged me every time I talked about my parents. And so initially when I started writing about this, and I mean, they worried the death out of me. And initially when I started writing this, I was trying to write from an academic distance. So initially I was only writing about Mae Mallory and just kind of skimming around, my mother. But my mother and my father were so influential in this, in this, that I had to, include them. Mae and Pat and Mrs. Johnson were family members to us. And so it was very difficult when I began writing this in so many different ways. My mother had died only a couple of years previously. And so initially I was writing from a distance. And so I would go to conferences and I would only use my mother's maiden name, and I would never, ever reveal that these were my family. And so I went to a conference at Sarah Lawrence College, and the original writer of Mae Mallory, this young woman at Sarah Lawrence College, whose name is escaping me at the moment, this Malaysian young woman, she stood up and she said, kind of like you, she said, well, so who are these women? I said, well, these are, women that I'm writing about. She's like, no, who are these women? Because she had contacted me to help her with her master's thesis. I said, well, these are, these women. She's like, you need to say that these are your family members. And so because of that, I started to rethink it. And then when I, with the iterations for the book contract, they have been telling me that I have to include the fact that this is my family and that I have to include my personal remembrances as well.
Thank you. So does that pose a challenge, do you think, in the academy in terms of what they might consider veracity or true scholarship? Because the way in which you present the information is so conversant and actually kind of almost like a movie. Mm-hmm. But you base it in the real activity of the era. So what does that look like in terms of how we look at history now in the 21st century of that late 20th century period?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of new scholars who are writing about their families, and they are, instead of writing from an academic distance, they are revealing that these people are their families. I'm thinking about Harambe City. I'm thinking about the books by these other books by, excuse me, let me get her name so I don't. So Harambe City, and this book by Tanisha C. Ford, where they are now revealing that these are their family members that they're writing about. And so I am, in a sense, modeling after them and have been in contact with the young lady who wrote the book Harambe City about the Cleveland Corps. And so that's what I've had to do.
I like the fact that you talked about education as a radical act. So Mae Mallory, trying to get her daughter into the desegregated schools, and then the daughter choosing teaching as a profession to kind of disrupt some of the ideas of what governmental agencies. How do you see education in the 21st century, especially African American women in education, K to grad school? What does that mean to see Black women in the classroom as well as administration? What does that mean to disrupt kind of the white supremacist narrative of the less than, especially for brown-skinned girls where they're now being disciplined at greater lengths than other persons in the classroom for behavioral problems?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience trying to educate my daughter has had few and far between Black people teaching her. So this past year, she actually has a wonderful African-American teacher. But I think because of the testing and the gatekeeping, Black women and Black men cannot get into the public school systems to teach Black children. And not only that, they are not being hired by private schools as well. I think that the best model is that we saw that was dismantled was in Brooklyn, Brownsville, where the parents said, we want Puerto Rican, African-American, Caribbean learning for our children. And it was quite successful for one moment in time. And then the state dismantled it. The same thing with Mae with her desegregation case. She and the other parents, the Harlem Nine, had formed a freedom school, so to speak. They removed their children from the public schools and they were teaching them themselves. For their efforts, Mae was incarcerated. Mae was accused of being a communist, which she was not. And for their efforts, they were maligned. But I think that the way the school system is set up, the public school system, with the testing and so on, I think it's very difficult in many cities for Black and non-white teachers to get in. Now, I do have a student in DC. She has founded her own school. And so that, I think, is the way that it can be done. If we found our own schools, for that.
Well, that's in the line of Bethune and Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Nannie Helen Burroughs and others. Now,
Yes.
interestingly enough,
and again, what a shame, Charlotte Hawkins Brown School is right down the street from us, which was a wonderful school. It has a beautiful campus and it is shut down. The same thing with the Black school, Storer University in Harper's Ferry. Yeah, West Virginia. A wonderful school with a beautiful, historical record, shut down. And so you have these systems in which Black schools were created and founded, but they have not continued. Or if they did continue, they have been put in put in the public school system. So for example, a great example is James Weldon Johnson's school in Jacksonville, Florida. That school was founded for the Black slaves, the former children of the Black slaves. Right now, it is a college preparatory school in which Black children cannot get in.
Wow, still named for James Weldon Johnson, I'm sure.
It was never named. It was called starts with the S, but I don't think they changed the name. It still has the Staten School.
Interesting.
Yeah, a shame. When I went there, I was like, there's no Black kids here. It's a college preparatory school.
Now, the irony of talking about Tanzania in light of the new elected premier of Tanzania, what do you think Mae Mallory would have said in terms of that? They've elected the first female president of Tanzania, a Muslim woman. And also, is Pat still living? Is Pat Mallory still?
Yeah,
okay.
Pat should be here. I invited her. I've done numerous interviews with her. Pat is not an old woman. She's a young, vibrant
I'm not saying old, but you never know. People who, life is so precarious now in light of all of this. But, and then her position, is she still in Tanzania or is she stateside?
No, because of the big bust, the CIA went in there and dismantled this very progressive revolution. They had to leave because Black Americans were being accused of being spies. And this was because of the CIA. So they only spent 10 years in Tanzania. And she said she tried her darndest to stay. And there are still some people who are still there. She told me there's a group called the Chicken Ends that are still there. And there's some other people that are still there, but many of them had to leave because it became so oppressive. But yeah, I think that, you know, if this woman is radical like they are, I think they would be very pleased. The new president of Tanzania, I don't know anything about her except for she's a woman. But I think that if she is radical like Mae and her daughter, they would be very, and Pat, they would be very pleased.
So I see your dad is in the room, and I see a Mallory person, Mason Mallory, who might be a relative of Pat.
Oh, I don't know who that is.
Okay. So then I'm asking for questions. I don't have any questions in the chat right now, but I will ask for any questions because, of course, Dr. Seniors and I can gladly have great conversation. And I sought to invite her to talk about the theme family, because that's our National Black History theme, is the Black family representation, identity, and diversity. And I think looking at the sisterhood of these women and their, what Stephanie Shaw calls an empowering realization that as Black women, there's a certain reality you live. Irrespective of generation or region or what have you, that I think in these different generations of women, you're talking 3 generations of women, actually 4, on some level, having a similar experience because the injustice is enduring. So one has to now look at what does the 21st century look like in terms of a matrix of seeking equity in education, equity in voting, or equity in just simply being a citizen or a resident of a particular space. How much more do we have to kind of prove our worthiness as such? So that might be a question, but I would like to get your opinion on that too. And then what do you see with this work? Do you see a documentary? Do you see something in terms of a multimedia platform where people who might not want to read a book might be interested in a documentary? I can really see bringing those geographies into line and then kind of looking at the idea of the optics of it all. In terms of the radicalism with the Blackness or the Africanity in dress, and then also the idea of respectability too, because they were very demure in their American or Western dress as well.
Yeah, but because they were working class, they were not considered respectable, and that's why we don't really know about these women because you know, Robert F. Williams maligned Mae until he died. You know, even though they had been allies in this fight, you know, they were not considered respectable. And this image of Mrs. Johnson, that's her FBI file picture, as well as the middle image of Pat Mae is her FBI image. You know, so yeah.
Can you talk about some of that tension between Williams and Mallory? Because we always want to kind of paint the Black radical past as one kind of united Black fist raised against the white oppressor, when there were so many fragments along gender, class, complexion, region, all these different kinds of fractures. Could you address some of that tension between Williams and Mallory for us to understand, like you said, the idea of class, and possibly even optics in terms of that as well?
Yeah, I think what part of the problem was that the FBI was very involved in what they called the fracturing these groups, and so the FBI actually put out their own Crusader newspaper, and Robert F. Williams on occasion accused Mae of being a spy, and she, you know, she steadfastly stood by him, you know, notwithstanding the fact that he was that way towards her, because she was working class. You know, the NAACP, you know, Corps and all, not the Cleveland Corps, but the other corps did not want anything to do with Mae. They felt that she was, you know, a low caste type of person, so you had these class differentiations that occurred. But I think that what happened between Mae and Robert F. Williams was definitely FBI, CIA involvement. I mean, but all these women have over 3,000 pages of FBI files on them, you know, and so I think that that's what happened there with them. Mae was involved with the Republic of New Africa as well. With Mrs. Johnson, we don't hear when people talk about the Revolutionary Action Movement. She has basically been erased as one of the founders and the co-chairman of the Revolutionary Action Movement. I even noticed in the writings of Max Stanford and others that they don't include her, even though she, you know, was right there founding it. so you have these erasures that these radical people engaged in, as well. Yeah.
And working class, that's very interesting that you're bringing a whole new dimension of class structure, because when you think of radicals, you don't tend to think of bourgeois or upper class persons being invested in anything to destabilize the status quo, because they're benefiting from such. So you think
Right.
middle to lower income persons be the more, quote, radicalized, so they have least invested in the system.
Right.
I'm going to ask the public again if they have any questions, but we're going to get ready to close in about 5 minutes. But I definitely applaud your work and your sense of transparency of linking this all the way up until the 1980s with what was happening in Nicaragua. And then what happened, because America did a similar campaign under Bush 1 to destabilize all of Central America. And so we're living in the wake of that as well. So you see this kind of ongoing situation. But for the women to talk, for your mother to be picking coffee, which I think is very interesting. I didn't know she did that kind of work, to be on the ground as human to human, both persons on a certain rung socially, and as women and mothers, different level of connection there. So that's fascinating.
Yes.
So I see there are no questions yet. So I guess what I'm going to do is ask, I see one question. Mason Mallory has his hand. Mr. Mallory, unmute yourself, I believe. And
yes, thank you. I just, maybe not as much of a question. I just wanted to thank Paula for her great work. I'm Mason. My grandmother is Mae Mallory. I received the invite from my Aunt Pat, and I'm just, really thankful for all the work you've done.
We met, right, at the Left Forum?
Yes, we have.
Okay, yeah, your dad.
Yes, it's been a few years ago. Yep. So. No, just excited to learn more about all the work that they've done, and hearing your mom's story has been pretty interesting as well. I'm really curious about her time in Grenada and the real, putting herself basically in the middle of the fire with revolutionary action. I don't know if you have more on that, but I see some photos there.
Yeah, she went to Grenada. She had every intention of going back, but the United States invaded Grenada and killed, Maurice Bishop and, his partner and all of that. So she could not go back. So instead of going back, she and others founded a group in support of the Grenadian Revolution, and in support of trying to get equity for the people in Grenada. And she was so hurt. I mean, I remember she and I listening to the invasion, and we both were just devastated when we heard that happen. And, it's interesting too, because, my mother went these places, and it never occurred to me that she might not come back. You know what I'm saying? And so, but she spent, I think she spent a good time in Grenada until, and she had every intention of going back, but because of the invasion, she was unable to go back. And there were many African Americans who were involved in the Grenadian Revolution. There was a woman who teaches at Sarah Lawrence, who ran their television station, and so on. But it was just such a horrific thing that happened there in Grenada. It was horrifying. Yeah. And again, with the U.S., the U.S. hand in there. Mason, I'd like to get your information at some point. Maybe we can figure that out.
Yes, I'll reach out through Pat, and we'll connect. But thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Great conversation. So I'm going to turn this back over to Eric White to bring us to a sense of closure. I want to thank Dr. Paula Seniors and all of our attendees for participating on today, and look forward to her book. I'm very excited about her work, and thank you for your work, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seniors, for this presentation. Women activists. Another family story. That's how I see it. And part of the theme of ASALH, as Dr. Jones has mentioned, the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. And we did hear a diverse story today. And I think when we look at our history, there are many avenues that our families have taken. and we need to be aware of this story as well as the common stories or other stories that we regularly hear about. We've had a great series of presenters this year, and this is one of them, because it gives us a different view of history. We heard last month from Dr. And I'm drawing a blank real quick here. We heard the story of of Mary Church Terrell, which was another woman activist. And we also heard from Barbara Llewellyn talking about the first Black museum that was set up in Ohio. And so we've heard some really diverse and different stories. And next month, we're going to have another speakers, Damani and Ife Keene, who are going to be talking about their book, Clandestine, The Time and Life of Mahari Otu Reddick, a saga of resistance and resilience, and activists used to intergenerational genealogy. So it's another story and another type of family story that we'll be hearing about next month, and we invite you to come back and join us at that time. I want to thank Dr. Jones, who is the president of the Bethel Dukes branch of ASALH, Demeter Green, who helped facilitate this presentation behind the scenes, LaWanda Broadneck, who introduced our speaker, and all of you who have joined this program, and we look forward to you joining us again next month. So thank you, and be sure to check the chat for the link to how to join ASALH. Thank you.